Frequency claims can also be made on the basis of observational research. Right? Observational research is when we watch people or animals and systematically record how they behave, what it is that they are doing. Right? People can't always report on their own behavior, as we've seen, or report accurately on their own behavior. So some researchers do believe that observational research overall is more valid than self-reports. Right? Self-reports, like we've seen, are subject to response biases or response sets, or socially desirable responding, and other types of biases, memory problems. So self-reports can be biased, whereas observational data may not have those problems. So overall, observational data may be more valid, maybe a more valid way to measure the construct that you're interested in. So again, observational research can be the basis for frequency claims. Observational research can also be the basis for association claims. Actually, a lot of the examples that we'll give are going to be of association claims rather than frequency claims. The book does this, I don't know why. But for an example of a frequency claim based on association research, right? Remember the example of when we're hanging out at an intersection and we're recording whether or not cars that are stopped, whether or not the driver is on their phone or not. Right? And if we're using that observation or those observations as the basis for saying this percentage of drivers is texting while driving, right? We're making a frequency claim on the basis of behavioral observations. Right? But yeah, self-reports that we talked about previously are good measures of what people think they're doing, right? Or what they think is influencing behavior. And so they're good measures when we have reason to believe that what people think they are doing is more or less consistent with what they're doing. But if we want to be more objective about what people are actually doing rather than what they think they're doing, then behavioral observations are more appropriate. So the book here gives several examples of behavioral observations. Right? One is observing how much people talk. So some research wanted to know how many words people say a day. So they clipped a microphone on people. So they recruited participants, gave them a small clip-on microphone that was linked to an iPod that was voice activated. So whenever you started talking, it started recording. Right? And later people looked at those recordings, had research assistants just transcribe all of those and then count the number of words that people said a day. And apparently people speak about 16,000 words a day. Right? That's a frequency claim based on behavioral observations. We didn't ask people what they think they say per day. No, we literally measured and counted, thus making it a behavioral observation. Another type of behavioral observation that the textbook gives as an example is where people and babies look. So we have special devices that can measure eye movements and can measure where we look. And so researchers can measure whether an infant looks at a toy or another human being. And so we can measure where people look. That's another type of behavioral observation. A third example that the textbook gives of a behavioral observation is where we record people's voice during dinners. and record the emotionality of their tone of voice, giving it a rating from 1, which is cold or hostile, to 4, which is neutral, to 7, which is warm and happy. And so we can rate the emotionality of people's voices, of their tone of voice. Right? That's another form of observational data. I kind of should point out here that that while these are all good examples of observational data, right? We're observing rather than asking people. We're measuring rather than asking people. Some of these examples are actually not frequency claims, but are association claims, right? If you read the text, they talk about differences between different groups of people. And if you remember, those are association claims rather than frequency claims. Frequency claim is making a statement about one variable. If you list differences between groups, you're talking about a relationship between two variables, namely the between group differences, men versus women, adults versus children, and another variable that we're measuring. I kind of hope that's not too confusing for you guys. But no matter. Point being that these are all observational data. And in each of these cases, note that these observations are probably better than self-reports, right? More valid than self-reports, more construct validity than self-reports. Right? For instance, in observing how much people talk, we probably would not get a good estimate if we asked people directly, how many words do you say a day? Right? We get a much more accurate measurement, a much more valid measurement if we actually observe and count. Note that when we are measuring where babies and caregivers look, well, when it comes to babies, we can't ask them directly, or at least we can, but they're not going to say anything meaningful. Right, so we have to rely on observational data. When it comes to caregivers, when we ask them directly, they may not know, right? Because people may not always have a good idea of where proportionally they look to different places. Likewise, by measuring the emotional tone of people, we get a measurement, we get an observation. If we were to ask people directly, they may not, again, be aware of the emotional tone that they have. So in each of these cases, in each of these examples, the observation, the measurement, is better than a self-report. Again, that's not to say that observations are always better than self-reports, and we talked about that too. Sometimes we have to rely on self-reports. Sometimes self-reports can give us accurate information too. For instance, gender identity, right? Right, but observations certainly can be a whole lot better than self-reports in many cases, which is why, like I said, in general, psychologists tend to see observations as more valid than self-reports. In general, not always. Now, again, this chapter is still about construct validity of different types of measurements. And behavioral observations too, we have to wonder about construct validity, right? Every single thing that we do in psychology, in any psychological study, we have to worry about construct validity. What's the thing that we want to measure, and how do we measure it? And the other way around, does the thing that I'm observing, does the thing that I measure accurately reflect the thing that I want to measure? So with behavioral observations too, psychologists have to worry about reliability and validity. Now, there are three main potential problems in behavioral observations that can threaten the construct validity of them. Okay, one of these is called observer bias. Observer bias happens when an observation's expectations influence the interpretation of the research participants that they're observing. Right, so instead of rating behavior or observing behavior objectively, their own ideas of what they're supposed to be seeing or what they may be seeing sort of colors their observations. Right, so in one study, therapists, so the participants in that study were therapists, watched a video of a guy talking about his feelings. And half of the therapists were told that this was a patient, other half of the therapists were told that this was a job applicant, and then each of these therapists was asked to describe the person on the tape. So yes, the people who were told that this was a patient described the person on the tape in very different ways than the people that were told that this was a job applicant, right? So in other words, they weren't objectively responding to the person on the tape. They were given an expectation of what they were going to see, a patient versus a job applicant, and that expectation colored their observations and their evaluation of this person. So researchers have investigated the observer bias a lot, right? This has been investigated. And as you remember from your intro psych class, to a degree we all do this. We're all subject to this, right? We all have some degree of observer bias. Seems to be inherent to us as humans, that we observe and interpret the world through the glasses that we have available to us. More on this later. As if observer bias weren't enough, another thing that may happen is that when an observer acts in such a way that it influences the participants to act in a certain way, to confirm the observer expectations, and may not even be aware of this. So in one experiment, for instance, that's pretty famous, the participants were psychology students, right? And they were each given a set of 5 rats to observe over the course of a couple of weeks. And these rats had to learn a maze, right? Now, half of these students were given a group of rats that were, as rats go, really bright, intelligent rats. And the other half of these students were given a group of rats that were not so bright. They were dull rats. They were stupid rats. Okay, and again, each of these students just had to teach these rats how to learn the maze, and researchers did indeed find that the students who were observing the smart rats those rats learned the maze quicker than the students who were observing the stupid rats. Now, here's of course the clinch, and you can feel this already. They were all observing the same rats. They were genetically identical rats. So it wasn't the case that one group of rats were smarter or faster than the other group of rats, but that these students who were observing the group of rats they thought were smart, they were treating them differently, such that the rats ended up finishing the maze faster than the rats that the students thought were dull. Right. So in other words, these students' expectations caused them to treat these rats in different ways, and then bring about the hypothesis or what they were told the hypothesis was. Right. So this is called an observer effect. When an observer, sort of by their own behavior, causes the participants to act in such a way as to confirm the observer's expectations.